The Denver Broncos had several young players fly under the radar with standout, consistent performances during OTAs and minicamp. We'll tell you why Jalen Virgil is the headliner there on today's brand new episode, Locked on Broncos.
You are Locked on Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast. Part of the Locked on Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey, what's up, Broncos Country? Welcome into another episode of Locked on Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast, part of the Locked on Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you so much once again to all the everydayers out there in Broncos Country. Thank you for tuning in and making us your first listen of the day every single day. And just a reminder, you can get Locked on Broncos for free on YouTube or wherever you get your podcast. So make sure you do us a favor, hit that subscribe or that follow button if you haven't done so already, so you never miss out on what's going on with your favorite team every single day, all year long. I'm Cody Roark, Broncos reporter from Mile High Sports, joined alongside, as always, by Sayre Bedinger, site expert over there at predominantlyorange.com. Today's episode, Locked on Broncos, brought to you by our friends over there at FanDuel. Make every moment more. And right now, new customers get $200 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $200 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. Visit FanDuel.com/locked on to get started. The buildup for training camp really begins here today, Sayre. Obviously, the Broncos offseason has now hit a little bit of a pause as players are on a 4.5-5 week break before they report back. I think we anticipate July 23rd or July 24th for the start of training camp. That's where our estimation is here. We'll wait for further confirmation on that. But with that said, there's still some storylines out of OTAs and mandatory minicamp that we'll continue to follow before we even get into our position previews and our biggest questions surrounding this team going into training camp. Really starting off by looking at three offensive players, three young guys on offense who had under-the-radar performances during OTAs and mandatory minicamp. Kicking things off here, Jalen Virgil, one of those guys who probably was on track to make the 53-man roster last year before he had that injury in the preseason. Sayre, I'll tell you this, he had a really good OTA and offseason program, some momentum going into training camp for him to build off of.
Well, I don't know if you intended for a pun there, Cody, but you said kicking things off with Jalen Virgil. I think that could be where he makes arguably the biggest impact in 2024 for this Denver Broncos team, is in the kickoff return department. Because, look, he was outstanding in doing exactly that at Appalachian State at the college level, and doing that with the rules, as we know, really restrictive for the kickoff return team. I mean, quite frankly, it's just a different era of football that we've been in over the last 10 plus years, where the NFL has been deliberately trying to remove that play from the game. And so when guys have excelled at returning kicks, given the fact that the rules are kind of against them, you kind of figure a guy like this is going to do really well now that the rules favor their skill set, because Jalen Virgil has outstanding vertical speed. I mean, ran a 4.38 or 4.39 in the pre-draft process a couple years ago. But not only that, he's kind of a big body. Like he's built more of like a running back. He's not a 6'5" receiver or anything like that, but he's about 6 feet, something like that, 215 pounds or so. I don't know what he's officially listed at right now, but he's a big body guy. And he's somebody that can, he can be physical in the open field. He can use his speed. He's got quickness. He's got vision. I think he's a really interesting player that, coming off injury, it sounds like there's really no setback as far as what you've seen out there, as far as what I've heard, from what you've said. So there's no setbacks. And hey, the rules now indicate that he could end up having a breakout year in 2024.
Well, I think the biggest question here is, how does the Broncos wide receiver room play out? And obviously here in a couple of weeks, we'll begin our position previews for training camp, biggest storylines, a look at the depth chart, who we think is going to make the 53-man roster. And I just think on first glance right now, the Broncos wide receiver room has a lot of guys. Like you and I have made various mentions of it here on the show that, hey, they have three guys of proven NFL production. They hope Marvin Mims can emerge in a bigger role here. Then they obviously drafted a rookie in Troy Franklin and another rookie in Devon Vele. And it's like, how does this room play out? Like, obviously, those are the projected guys. Everyone's like, all right, well, ideally, if you're building out your top 6, top 7 guys, all those guys kind of factor in there. You can't ignore Jalen Virgil. And there's another guy we're going to talk about that Broncos Country simply can't ignore as well a little bit later on here in today's show. But the thing for Jalen is he did bulk up a little bit. Like his upper body looks like he's got a little bit more bulk to him, a little bit more muscle mass. And in our final mandatory minicamp practice, Sayre, we actually got to see the Broncos running and working through their new kickoff, kick return setup and how that works there. And I tell you what, like there's so many different rules. I encourage Broncos fans, go to Denver's YouTube page and look up the interview with Ben Kotwika about it. We asked him a lot of questions. That was really the primary thing we asked him, was what he saw from that standpoint. Like, how do you implement certain changes? Like, he gave us some insight and information that we didn't know previously about the new return rules. I think Jalen has a really good chance to be there. Now, look, Sayre, I think there's a question we have to ask here, right? Obviously, Marvin Mims is a very, very good talent, one of the most electrifying returners in the game. Obviously, got a Pro Bowl nomination as a rookie for his return ability. If he's going to have a bigger role on the offensive side of the ball, wouldn't it make more sense to put Marvin on offense? Or do you keep him at kick return and maybe put a guy like Jalen Virgil back there? Or heck, let's just say maybe even a Jaleel McLaughlin. We won't talk about that just now, but like Jalen's one of those guys that can fit in there as a return guy. Do you think that the Broncos should maybe remove Marvin from that responsibility, or do you think that it maybe plays to his advantages a little bit?
I think it's a unique conversation for sure, because the play is totally different now. Whereas a year ago, you might have said, well, you're really putting Marvin Mims in harm's way by having him, because it's a danger. I mean, the way kickoff returns as we've known them have been, it's a very dangerous play, even for him to go out there and just return it a time or two each week. So it was way more dangerous. Now I almost wonder, I mean, it's almost a play. It's almost your first play from scrimmage, right? So it's different, it's uniquely constructed, but I think Marvin
looks safer, by the way.
It's safer for sure, and it's still a football play, we get that, but at the same time, Marvin can be still, I think, utilized in this way. But from what I've been gleaning from Sean Payton, and I'll have to listen to the interview with Ben Kotwika as well, but it sounds to me like they're going to need multiple guys out there who can field kicks properly, who can do these things. It's not just, well, it's Marvin Mims and anybody else that returns kicks, out of the mix, right? So maybe correct me if I'm wrong on that one.
No, so you make a great point, because this was a question I had that got answered immediately at practice. Like, all right, is there just going to be one kick returner back there? Like, essentially, there's going to be two guys back there to return. And basically what you're seeing is if they kick it to one side, one guy, the guy who, the ball's kicked to, is going to field it. The other guy's going to come up and become a blocker for that guy. Like, so there's two guys. Like, if it's Marvin, going to be Marvin and Jalen here. I think Jalen would be a great choice for it. And considering as well, like, outside of the return aspect here, Jalen is a guy that was making plays, catching passes from all different quarterbacks, all three of them, Jarrett, Bo, Zach. But my question here is, if he can't play an extended role on offense, like, what do you need? And I think you need key special teams guys. And I'll say this, Jalen at gunner, I mean, prior to his injury last year, and even like in his rookie season, we saw him, Sayre. What did we see him do? He excelled as a gunner downfield. He's getting a lot of reps there. He can be a key special teams player. Is that going to change? Like, the biggest question we have here for this offseason is, we don't know how the new special teams rules are going to affect how you build a roster in terms of how many guys you keep on your depth chart, let's say at receiver. Like, historically, we always look at 5 or 6 guys, but because of the new rules, do you keep 7 or 8? Like, is there more value there? I don't know where Denver's at. Like, that's the biggest mystery I think we're going to have going into this offseason, is not knowing how the team plans to build their roster depth-wise with the roster limitations that they have in place, but with the need that you have on special teams now with the rule changes. That's the biggest dynamic. But Jalen is a guy, Sayre, that stood out in a big way during the OTAs and offseason program. Happy for him coming off the knee injury there. You're going to need that going forward. And look, wide receiver is one of those positions, Sayre. There's so many guys there. And look, Jalen wasn't the only standout there. David Sills was another standout here for the Broncos offense in terms of also being a consistent player at the wide receiver position. How does Denver navigate this? We'll tell you why David Sills has a path to the roster potentially if he has a strong training camp on today's brand new episode, Locked on Broncos. Broncos Country, today's episode of Locked on Broncos is brought to you by our friends over there at FanDuel Sportsbook. And as you all know, at FanDuel, they are America's #1 sportsbook, and they want you to get involved in all the action that's going on in the world of sports this summer. Yes, summertime. We always think about grilling. We think about everything that's coming up with NFL training camp. But summertime is also an exciting time because that means baseball, the NBA Finals, and more. And you can bet it all on FanDuel. And right now, they're offering where new customers get $200 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. You sign up as a new customer today, place a $5 bet on anything. That bet wins. You're automatically going to win $200 in bonus bets. That's $200 that you can use to bet on everything from the finals MVP to who's going to hit one out of the park in an MLB game, or you can get ahead on NFL futures, over-unders on how many games you think the Broncos are going to win. Are they going to win more than 5.5 games according to FanDuel Sportsbook? If you believe they are, well, you can put that on the line there at FanDuel. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and add a big win to your summer bucket list. FanDuel is America's #1 sportsbook.
The Denver Broncos are loaded at the wide receiver position. And look, David Sills is a guy that the team, they like and they believe in. And he had a good OTAs. We're going to break down his chances of making the Denver Broncos roster in 2024 on today's episode, Locked On Broncos. But want to say thank you and give a shout out to all of you who make Locked On Broncos your first listen of the day every single day, wherever and however you listen to your podcast. Free available on all those platforms, as well as you can watch the show on YouTube. And look, if you're already on YouTube, or if you're not already on YouTube, go ahead, go subscribe to Locked On Broncos on YouTube, and then make the switch from whatever national sports shows you're watching every day to Locked On Sports Today. It's a free 24/7 sports streaming channel programmed for you every day to bring you the biggest stories and all the can't miss analysis, opinions, and news from local experts of the teams that you love. It's streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Let's talk about David Sills, because look, this guy's, I mean, Google David Sills sometimes. If you're a listener to the show, you have no idea the story of David Sills. You're like, who's this random guy they're talking about? Kind of a crazy story. David Sills was offered a scholarship to, I believe it was USC when he was like 13, 14 years old. He was in middle school at the time. And he was a quarterback, and he transitioned at the college level to wide receiver at West Virginia, caught a lot of touchdown passes there. Really an interesting journey through the NFL, kind of like, unable to really crack the rotation for anybody consistently here. But the Broncos pro scouting department kind of prioritized him last year, didn't they? They brought him into the practice squad after roster cuts. He's been on the team now for almost a year, Cody. What did you see from him at OTAs? Why do you think maybe there's a chance he could end up making this 53-man roster?
I mean, we highlighted Josh Reynolds as one of the most consistent players at practice in terms of wide receiver. David Sills is 1B, right? If Josh Reynolds is 1A, David Sills is 1B. And look, while he's obviously not going to be the guy that everyone's like, oh, flashy playmaker or anything like that, he reminds me so much of just like the janitor. Like, he just comes in, gets the job done. And the thing about David Sills, and this is something I want to make a point in reference to back to last season, he was on the roster long enough, obviously had all of his practice squad to active roster game day elevations met there. Sean Payton, for some reason, sees a lot of something in him, right? He's a guy that does what he's asked to do consistently. And look, we had talked about some of the stories here of Johnny Moe, the Broncos passing game coordinator on offense. He wants these guys to run routes at a certain landmark every time. And when you look at all the other players that are running routes, you see some guys that mess up. I didn't see David Sills mess up or get yelled at by Johnny Moe in any way, shape, or form. In fact, I saw David Sills probably get more praise from Johnny Moe than any other player during OTAs, during mandatory minicamp. This is a guy who's a true technician, right? And I think David Sills knows he's probably not, like, in comparison to an athletic profiles of guys like Cortland Sutton, the other guys around the league. He's not going to have that. So what does he have to do in order to get the best opportunity to play? Well, he has to play smart. He has to be a technician. He has to do the things that the coaching staff is asking him to do. And more importantly, when he gets those opportunities to catch the ball, he's got to do that. I didn't see him drop a single pass during Broncos OTAs or minicamp. He became a consistent day-to-day. Okay, this guy's under the radar, probably not going to be talked about enough, but something that Broncos fans, when they're in attendance in training camp in July, they need to pay attention to David Sills here as he's going out there, number 87, going out there making catches, making plays. You saw a lot of it, and I think he's got a good momentum profile that's going to build up towards the NFL training camp start period, because that is a loaded room, as we've talked about, in terms of guys. I think I was talking with Andrew Mason about this when we were kind of in agreement about the wide receiver room. Okay, you have your top heavy guys, your top 4 guys that, you project to be there. But you look at the rest of the guys there. We talked about Jalen Virgil, David Sills, and even like Michael Bandy, honorable mention, shout out to him. Another player who stood out and didn't drop a single pass during OTAs and minicamp, was making plays there. Denver has a lot of unproven talent at the wide receiver position. Now, you're going to lose some guys, I think, to roster cuts or like in the NFL preseason, as long as there's still 3 games going on right now. Teams are going to get an extensive look at some of these guys, and you're going to lose some of them. But if you can bring some of these guys back to the practice squad that you know aren't simply going to be able to make the 53-man roster because you have needs elsewhere, I think this is where David Sills has the advantage. Though I wouldn't be surprised if he is and emerges to be the standout preseason player in terms of the rotation, like through 3 games. Do not be surprised if David Sills is one of the leading receivers in the preseason for Denver, and that might get him an opportunity elsewhere.
Yeah, and that's the scary thing is like Sean Payton just said it as they closed out mandatory minicamp, right? He's like, training camp is all about figuring out how you can arrive at the correct 53-man roster, right? And you don't want to let guys go. And he's mentioned this multiple times that you don't want to let guys go who end up going and, playing really great somewhere else. And yeah, you wish them well if you cut them, but at the same time, it's like, well, why did we let that guy go then? What did we miss? And so you can't miss these things. And this is a tough position because we just got done talking about Jalen Virgil and how the rosters could be reconstructed due to special teams, the kickoff return, and the Broncos' top 5 spots at receiver, assuming that Troy Franklin, who Sean Payton also said they had a 2nd-round grade on Troy Franklin, so you figure he's not going anywhere. The top 5 spots seem to be set at receiver. So does that mean they're going to try to keep 6 or 7? How does that affect running back, which we'll talk about in our training camp position previews, where you got 5 guys right now that it's tough to say, all right, you cut this guy unless he performs poorly or something like that. So David Sills is kind of caught in the crossfire of, he's performing well at practices. He had a great preseason last year that obviously got noticed by the Broncos enough to the point that he was like, I'll leave the New York Giants and I'll come to Denver to work with this offense and Sean Payton and to kind of grow in this system. And that was an investment that he made in himself and belief in himself to get an opportunity now. So it's like, how many spots are there? Where's Lil Jordan Humphrey, Devon Vele? Like you mentioned, Michael Bandy. There's so many guys out there at receiver that's like, for me, Cody, I'm sitting here thinking, finally, we're having a conversation about making difficult decisions at receiver. We didn't even mention Brandon Johnson. And I know that's, it's just one of those things that's like right now, what does David Sills have to do at camp in the preseason in order, because he could have the best preseason of any receiver on this team that may ultimately not lead to a roster spot. It's going to be really tough for him.
I think ultimately you're going to see some of these guys. There are going to be, I think, 1 or 2 players from the Broncos roster, whether it's on offense or defense, that have a really good preseason, really good training camp, that don't necessarily make the 53-man roster, that end up getting plucked by another team after, roster cuts happen, waivers, or if they pass waivers, there might be opportunities for them to sign with another team. I think you're going to see a couple of these guys. David Sills could be in that conversation. I mean, I think you look at it right now as like, can he offer a role to the Broncos on offense? I mean, I think he could, Sayre, but I mean, right now, if the top heavy portion of this depth chart, as we anticipate it to be, stays healthy, there's not going to be playing time. There's not going to be reps for a guy like David, which is the tough dilemma, right? But the emphasis for Denver, they want to draft, they want to develop guys. Obviously, David Sills, they didn't draft him, but he's a guy who's currently developing for them right now. And maybe could be something like, I don't know what this year holds. Obviously, you factor in Cortland Sutton. It's got 2 years left on his deal. Tim Patrick will be a free agent after this year. Like, you have some decisions. You're going to have some openings there. I think you're going to have to weigh in now versus also later when you make some of these decisions. And thankfully, we don't have to make those decisions. The Broncos have to do that. Tough business all around here. But David Sills, under the radar, had a very underrated OTAs and offseason program, and another player who did as well. Somebody who Broncos Country is very excited about. There's always an undrafted rookie free agent that makes the roster every year. Broncos Country is excited about Blake Watson. I'll tell you why. You are warranted in that excitement. While there is things to be excited about, how can he make hay to become a player in the rotation for the Broncos at running back this upcoming season? We'll dive deep into that and much more here on today's brand new episode, Locked on Broncos. As we jump into the fourth quarter action on today's episode, Locked on Broncos, real quick, Broncos Country, want to say thank you once again for tuning in, making us your first listen of the day every single day. Whether you listen to us wherever you get your podcasts or whether you watch us on YouTube, If you watch us on YouTube, make sure you engage in the comment section with other members of Broncos Country. Get in the conversation, debate, and keep it respectful, keep it friendly. Obviously, an amazing community we've built here, Locked On Broncos. We're so grateful for everybody here in Broncos Country here. Sayre, talking about undrafted rookie free agent Blake Watson as we go through and talking about our Denver Broncos who are under the radar standouts this offseason in OTAs and mandatory minicamp on the offensive side of the ball here. Blake Watson is a guy who really, I think, in probably the end half of OTAs entering minicamp, you're like, okay, hey, this is a guy who stood out. And you certainly see the traits with him. Like you see the vision, you see the explosiveness, you see like him running with authority, but you also see how Sean Payton said he kind of got excited like a little bit. He said, you want to throw him the ball in the backfield. He did a lot of that during OTAs and minicamp. The biggest obstacle here for Blake Watson is that the Broncos have, as you mentioned it, 5 guys at the running back position right now. There's plenty of competition there, and that's one that we're excited to see kind of unfold in training camp. We won't dive into that right now, but Blake is certainly a player I think Broncos Country needs to keep an eye on, especially when the pads come on. That's the next biggest step for him.
Yeah, he's a former wide receiver, right, from Old Dominion, who moved to the running back position and played at Memphis this last season. And quite frankly, Cody, of all the guys that went undrafted, I was a little bit shocked, maybe the most, about Blake Watson, just because in the pre-draft process, you hear all this stuff about his pass catching skills, and then he runs a sub 4.4 in the 40-yard dash, and how valuable are those traits in today's NFL at the running back. And this wasn't a great running back draft. I mean, in all honesty, like I can't remember when the first guy was taken. It was sometime on day 2, but it was not a good running back class. And for a guy like this to have that third down ability immediately, I mean, you see the pass catching traits right away when you turn this. It's not like he's just getting dump offs. I mean, he's clearly a very gifted receiver. And so to me, a shock that he was undrafted in general, a shock that given the Broncos had met with him in the pre-draft process, that they didn't take him with either of their 7th rounders. I mean, I was really excited that they signed him as an undrafted player. And of course, the Broncos were excited as well, because look, he got a bigger guarantee than pretty much any other undrafted free agent in Broncos history. And I know that changes every year, but even if you adjust for inflation or whatever you want to call it, he's very valuable to this team. So I like this addition. I think that the thing for me is, as we're kind of prepping for our own, predictive roster construction, as you look at the running back position, how much do you weigh the future at this spot? I mean, Samaje Perine, how much longer is he going to be around beyond this year? I know Sean Payton said that they're going to build the roster to win right away. They're not trying necessarily to sacrifice the moment for the future. But at the same time, what are you projecting for Blake Watson if you're the Denver Broncos, right? That's the question I'm trying to ask. Are you projecting that he can eventually become, a true third down weapon and maybe replace Perine as the 2-minute drill guy? Because Perine does a lot. I mean, he pass protects, he catches passes, he creates after the catch. He's a veteran. He's been in big games. That's going to be tough for a rookie undrafted player to come in and just take over.
Do you look to go younger at the position, considering the overall perception of the running back market and how running backs, in my opinion, are unfairly evaluated? Like, they're expected to do the most in terms of absorb the most contact. You need to produce the most touchdowns because you are the key part of the offense. You need to keep drives moving there. A lot of pressure has been put on the running back position in general. And obviously, as we get into our training camp previews here in a couple of weeks, we'll highlight Javonte a little bit in that conversation here. But do you look to go younger where, let's say, for example, it is an Audric Estime, Jaleel McLaughlin, Blake Watson, 3-headed rushing attack in the future? Maybe not necessarily right away here, but maybe next year. Maybe that is the formula. Maybe that is where the Broncos want to go here. I think for Sean, and so much of it as well, like we were talking about this with Jaleel last year. Jaleel was a guy that's like, all right, hey, how do you make it as an undrafted guy? Like you look like a standout. Okay, what do you look like, with shoulder pads? And the biggest challenge for Jaleel last year was, okay, he looks good here. Can he do it in training camp? Well, that's exactly what he did. And I'll say this with Blake Watson. There were several plays during OTAs and mandatory minicamp where he went untouched up the middle for a big gain, got to the sideline on a couple of plays there. It's like, all right, that's nice. You want to be able to see that. And obviously you see the traits, you see the ability to catch out of the backfield, the ability to be motioned out to a receiver, to run a route, catch the ball, and then make plays there. You saw all that, but can you do that when the pads come on? I think that's the next step here for Blake Watson in terms of where he's at. Can he build on the momentum he's generated a little bit here during OTAs and minicamp? But more importantly, are the Broncos in a position right now where they can maybe look at the future a little bit earlier? That's a tough conversation. And that's obviously something we'll talk about in our training camp preview that we're going to do here in about a week and a half, 2 weeks time. I just don't know. Like, I think it's hard based on the construction of this roster. How do you see Blake Watson getting reps? Especially if there are other guys ahead of him. And I will say his effort and his willingness or his desire to get involved on special teams has been something that's also stood out to me as a gunner, as a jammer, as a guy on different kickoffs and even like different units that he's been working with. He's a guy that like wants to get reps. Like there was one time where, it was punt team and he just did a rep. He wanted to come back and get another rep. Coach said, like, somebody else go in there, for this one rep. He's like, coach, I want to go in. Like, he wants to be on the field. And if he's not going to get carries as a rookie, he wants to find a way. How can I be on the field? How can I be on this roster? How can I have an opportunity to keep my career alive? I think so much of how the running back position is viewed now, Denver could very well be forward thinking with how they look to approach this position. And Blake Watson is a guy who fits a little bit of what Sean Payton wants. Maybe, like I said, Sean's always looking for the next Pierre Thomas at this point, but it's just a long road here for Blake Watson. He's going to have to make up a lot of ground, and it's not necessarily his fault. Like, he is a standout player, but I think you look at the circumstances of this roster right now and the position in general where Denver is at, you have to ask yourself, how is Sean Payton and George Payton planning to build this position right away? Like, that's the question here.
It is, and it's a tough one because there's more guys than I think are going to make the team, which is it just leads to those difficult decisions down the road. But I'm going to throw a hot take as we get ready to close out this episode, Cody. Here's a flaming hot take. I know that the team assigns numbers based on what's available, but the conspiracy theorist in me, I don't have my tinfoil hat next to me right now. The conspiracy theorist in me wonders if there's a coincidence behind Blake Watson getting assigned number 43, right? Because who's a famous number 43 that played for Sean Payton with the New Orleans Saints at the running back position? Very similar play style and skill set. Well, that'd be Darren Sproles, right? And so you can't help but wonder, I mean, does maybe Sean Payton see a little bit of that in his game? Because Sean was kind of gushing over him the last time he was asked about Blake Watson and went on is waxing poetic over his skills and things like that. And he's been in a good mood this offseason, and he didn't say anything about Darren Sproles, but I'm personally wondering there, and maybe we can float this out in Broncos country and see if it circulates or anything, but is there a coincidence, the fact that he was assigned number 43? They could have assigned him any number, and I'm just saying any number that was available. So I don't know. Maybe there's something there. Maybe a little pass catching role. Maybe Sean Payton's been like, hey, why don't you go watch the Darren Sproles highlights from my time in New Orleans, things like that. So that wouldn't surprise me at all. And I think you're onto something there, Cody, with him being involved in special teams. I mean, of course, we know the story of Terrell Davis, that hit that he made in Japan in a preseason game on kick coverage or punt coverage, and how that led to him getting on the roster. That can make your presence on the team non-negotiable if you start to impress the special teams staff as well as the head coach. So I think that's all working in his favor very much so. Even despite my hot take about his jersey number, I think Blake Watson has a decent shot of making this team.
Can even factor in as one of those potential returners. Like I said, if there's two guys back returning, he can make a case, especially in preseason. Look, if he somehow in the preseason takes a kick return for a touchdown, then I think we can say, all right, like there's his path right there alongside like Marvin or somebody else at this point. I'm excited to see how it's all going to fold out, like all the rule changes. It's definitely going to make roster construction a little bit more of a dynamic conversation as we get deeper into the preseason, as we get a little bit deeper into things leading up to the kickoff of regular season week 1. As we know, the Broncos will take on the Seattle Seahawks. There's a lot of intrigue here, I think, about this team. Overall, I think the vibe here, a lot of the younger players, I think are stepping up in a bigger way than we've thought. And that's something that Sean Payton has also alluded to himself. So that leaves us with this question here. Broncos country, What are your thoughts here on these three players that we talked about? Jalen Virgil, David Sills, and Blake Watson. There's a lot of conversation about how maybe they can make the roster, what path they have to take to do just that. But they were under the radar standouts on offense during the offseason program. So for all you everydayers who want to tune into tomorrow's episode of the show, here's what you can expect. We'll take a look at three young players on the Denver Broncos defense who were under the radar standouts as well during the offseason program. You'll get that and much more in tomorrow's brand new episode, Locked on Broncos.